Thank you to all three of our speakers for those presentations. They were fantastic. We've got lots of time for questions. So if anyone has any questions off the bat, if they'd like to ask, anyone? Okay, well, I have a question. I'm not sure, this is just a sort of observation that occurred to me when you were speaking, and maybe you could each sort of respond to it somehow, that kind of the current politics around race and racism in our image-addicted culture is centred on visibility and promoting visibility. So more black people on TV, more black people in art galleries, black model on the cover of Vogue. Like, this is the kind of game that seems to be played. And in the natural world, there's a hyper-visibility of the person of colour when they enter these spaces. And I was wondering whether or not you think the hyper-visibility and the kind of politics around visibility could ever be reconciled, and how they might relate to one another.
I'm not sure what you're suggesting might be a clash or a contradiction.
Yeah, there's a clash and a contradiction, and I'm wondering maybe even politically how the kind of work that you're doing, for example, might fit into a kind of broader politics of race and racism that's going on now.
I think in terms of experiencing it, there not necessarily being a very visual representation of people of colour in nature creates a feedback loop of black people thinking, oh, this space isn't for me, there's no one like me there. But also when we are there, being visible can feel very exposing and make us feel vulnerable. So there's definitely a relationship to visibility and the experience or the fear of racism, if that sort of touches on your question.
I guess there's an unfortunate transition, but an inevitable transition of being hyper-visible until you are unremarkable, unfortunately. If nobody strikes out and nobody goes into the space because, I'm going to stick out, we're always going to stick out when one of us eventually decides to venture in. So I guess there's strength in numbers, and it's wonderful when we can congregate and actually then not just be the only one, but also just find that strength, that resilience to head out into these spaces. As many times as there's been a marked sense of being the outsider or people looking at me, there's also been me getting ready, me kind of having this energy of like, just try and stare at me. Just like fucking like have at it. And actually no one caring and just walking around and, someone might nod and be like, oh, good morning or whatever. And, I'm ready for, an awkward exchange or whatever else. And that person just not caring because they're just having a walk in the woods and I'm having a walk in the woods. So I think, obviously it's important to be aware of your surroundings and your place within them, but to just, just know that you have a right to be there as much as anyone else, and we've all got to persevere with that so that eventually there's a neutrality to our presence. I don't know how long that's going to take, but yeah, I feel like that's the only way. And there's just that inevitable bit in the middle where it is strange. So I don't know.
I agree, and I think that the challenge is it's a mixture of, on the one hand, you want role models, because I think there's also a sense, at least for me, I think part of the thing as well with the natural world that makes it appeal, or that make it appealing to young people as well, is that in addition to what you were talking about as a point of therapy and healing, and as a point of fun, as you were talking about, for me it's also been something as a point of where one can make a career around something, or you can achieve in something, and you can, people want, you need aspirational stories of nature as well, and that it's not some backwater or you're turning away. Either you can do something in an urban setting where you have a public profile, or you can do something in a natural setting, which is somehow where you give up your ego and you go and live in that. What I'm saying is that I think each of the natural, different people as different young people growing up will have different things that they're looking for, and the reason why so many people at the moment want to be footballers or want to be musicians or things like that is not always because they're intrinsically attracted to each of those professions, but because of what those professions signify and what that enables and who that allows them to join, and all of that kind of stuff. And so I think the real way that you can shift things in a culture is if you realize for people that by entering into studying the natural world, you can, just as much as in all these other areas, create an identity that has a certain, I sort of almost want a better word, but a glory to it, a sense that I can be something important here, but it also can make my living and my work in the natural world. And I think that going back to the idea of having visible role models, I think that there is a role of celebrities in all of this, and you can kind of denigrate celebrity culture, but on the other hand, it has a huge effect when you see celebrities who people just have that recognition factor, and you're able to suddenly someone and who your friends think is cool is doing something. Suddenly you can just go, and it just, I think it just, a lot of the tension. I mean, I know growing up I was like a complete outlier being interested in the natural world, and people thought I was crazy that I'd go off on weekends studying birds. I tried to start a natural history society, and nobody came. And then I said, well, we'll play some David Attenborough videos, and then people started coming. And so people, especially I think when you're young, you want that celebrity has a big role to play.
I mean, it's so trite to say it, but the imaging of it all is so important, whether we like it or not. So I totally agree with you. If we could have like a cool, engaging, like TV presenter or social media personality even, who there is actually Brother Nature. Have you heard of him? He's this young. I'm not too sure what his racial background is, but he's definitely not white. And yeah, he racks up loads of views on his videos online. He just goes around and like talks about animals, and he's really excitable. And silly things like that make a big difference,
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you. So the exhibition downstairs, The Lie of the Land, is about how the access to enjoyment of the landscape has changed over time, from the 18th century to the present day. So could you talk a bit about how the experience of the person in colour in nature, you may have seen that change either representationally or in terms of your own experience over the course of your lifetime?
I guess it sort of follows on just from the last point, but there's something for me about access and acknowledging not just our disconnect from nature, but our social dysfunction. What I'm really hearing in that sort of last reflection was that nature needs to be presented to children. And to me, that's weird. Why does it need to be presented? Why is it not just there where they can find their own way? That's very different to my experience of just opening the door and there you are. I acknowledge it's now relevant, but I think we need to acknowledge what we've lost, that we're now in a position where we actually have to present nature in the first place. And there are many real issues of young people in cities, and because of the areas where people of colour live tend to be more dense in areas of deficiency of access to natural spaces, of struggling to get access, issues like postcode wars. If your Green Park is over the other side in a different postcode, it's difficult for you to get there. Young children are often not allowed on the street, let alone to go and play down the park. So there's a real issue in terms of sort of right to roam in the context of, walking down your road. I was featured in the BBC documentary Nature's New Wild and Cities, and they referenced some of the research that I put together that shows that young children now spend less time outdoors than the prison population. It's really shocking. It is about not accessing nature, but it's also simply a sense of freedom of movement, being outdoors, that their lives are so indoor orientated. So in terms of change, I think that would be the backward steps that I see. Is I spent my childhood roaming. I'd come home, I'd be locked out, it would be 11 at night. Freedom and lack of freedom.
Just to follow, I mean, I guess the way the context in which I know about it more is in the representation of people of colour in African ornithology, particularly because most of the people who were writing the books on birds in different countries in Africa were colonials, and there was always this thing of the native assistant, and you sort of read back through all of these ornithologists, often whom are commemorated in the names of the various species that they described, and occasionally the native assistant is also commemorated in those names, and that's been something that I've been very conscious with in our own current work, where we spend a lot of time in Zambia, and being very careful about not wanting to fall into those tropes, and trying to make sure. So, for example, I shared a photo with me and two of my research assistants, Silke Hamama and Collins Moyer, both of whom are co-authors on the works that I do, and similarly, Lazaro Homosekile is also a co-author. And so, the change that I would like to see in a Zambian context, and what I'm sort of working towards, is to go away from that model where you have the European scientist whose vision is facilitated, and a sense instead that there's there's always been a flow of information going in multiple. Even the colonial types would freely admit that they learned hugely from people of the countries that they were working in, but then that was never really represented in the scientific literature that came afterwards, and I think that's a very important shift in the way that people of colour in that context, I think, need to be represented, and something that I feel I'm trying to actively work towards in the years to come.
Questions? We can do about mics for questions. Thanks.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I'm glad, Vanessa, that you brought Brother Nature, because I was actually scribbling notes about him when you were talking, because one of the things that I think is so interesting about him is how he's viewed along the lines of authority. And I wanted to kind of ask, maybe some questions about authority as a methodology in nature, because I feel like there's a Brother Nature thing where he's seen as a comedian, right? I would argue primarily. I think primarily he's seen as a comedian. I don't think primarily he's seen as a naturalist, even though he is trained. I just read his Wikipedia while you were talking, which I think is really interesting, right? He does have university training in the natural environment, but the way that he is able to be visible is as comedy. So I think that's super interesting.
Well, I think we always assume that accessibility or popularity dilutes things, right? I get that as a poet because most people can understand my poems. They're not especially abstruse or complicated. There's lots of dog whistle terminology for the type of poetry I do, spoken word, urban poetry, even though I grew up in Kent and went to private school. I'm not especially urban, to be quite frank with you, but do you know what I mean? There's lots of that shit going on. The idea that because I'm young, because I'm black, because I express myself in a very casual way, I have the vernacular that I have, that I don't have a brain, or that I don't have intellect, or I don't have expertise. And I'm not especially, I used to be very preoccupied with asserting that and showing that. Even just being on panels, I used to get very stressed because I'd be on panels with people with PhDs and this and that and the other, and I was like, oh God, I just write poems and chat shit. But I'm very good at chatting shit and writing poems. So it's about understanding the fact that my world has its own history, its own lineage, its own very rich and diverse culture. Do you know what I mean? You could definitely study it in academia. You could definitely write dissertations on it. It's not a one-dimensional or a thing that you can easily dismiss, even if it's not, something that you'd find in the literary canons, as it were. And I think that's very much what someone like Brother Nature would be a victim of, because he's making this thing that is so often, the preserve of galleries and of BBC nature documentaries, and very hard to find books accessible to the masses. He's putting it on Twitter and Instagram. Oh, of course he's diluting it. Of course he can't actually be someone who knows what he's talking about. It's all just condescending and disappointing, because we're not seeing that as the wonderful opportunity to break down barriers that it is. So that would be my opinion on that.
So related to that, though, just to because I feel like there's something about authority as a methodology of engaging with nature that I kind of want everyone to speak about, and maybe like the organizers as well, because there's the brother nature dynamic where his actually quite canon authority is being challenged via his language. There's the assumption of your lack of authority, right, because of how you look when you move through the countryside. And then there's also this there's this element of authority which is predicated on the ability to name something, right, which I think is very much in line with what Gabriel's work is. And then in that sense, I also wonder, from someone who has such an awareness of the history of the kind of colonial project of naming, the modern project of naming, as a form of ownership, right? Which is, for me, has been most striking as someone who's not from England, has been the most striking element of the English countryside, is actually noticing how built it is, as an exhibition sometimes, kind of. It does feel like you're being shown a thing that someone manicured back and was sit here, look at this thing.
It's very pruned, it's very...
Yeah. So, I guess I just want everyone to kind of talk about authority and ownership in this context.
I think, in terms of the naming thing, I think obviously the act of naming has been used in a colonial context to certain ends, but obviously the idea of naming and categorizing predates colonial. I think it's there's a Chinese saying about the first step to knowledge is, and we all go around the world categorizing. That's how we make sense of the world, is we categorize things in different ways, and in order to refer to them we sort of ascribe names to them. So I feel that names are like rungs in a ladder, and as long as you don't believe in them too much and you understand that they are a vehicle to get to places, then I think they're essential and important. But I agree with you that often they can be used as something to beat people over the head with, and I think that's a misuse of naming. But I wouldn't then say that the project of naming itself is something that I don't feel that's where the problem lies.
I swear I'm going to stop talking after this, but I'm very fascinated by your research. But what does your being able to name certain things facilitate that you are excited about? You know what I mean? Teach me.
I think in naming something, there's an implicit definition that comes with that, and often in the scientific literature, it's not just implicit, but you've said, I believe that this phenomenon needs to be categorized as something separate to this other phenomenon, despite many superficial similarities that we might see, that if we categorize it in one way, it facilitates this particular type of knowledge. If we categorize it in another way, it facilitates another type of knowledge. And again, you can have many naming systems, and they can facilitate different types of knowledge, but you still need to have those names so that you can communicate ideas to other people, and that people from different places around the world who maybe independently come across objects in the world can relate their observations of an object to someone else's observations of an object. So for me, it's the essential vocabulary by which you communicate ideas, and and as long as you hold it lightly, then I think you need it in order to make any steps forward as a scientist, at least.
I agree with Vanessa.
Do you think that people will, or people who are in authority, will often use Latin names instead of popular names? And is there something in that usage which, in a way, is like a bit of one-upmanship in relation to the average member of the public?
Yeah, I think, the thing with Latin names is actually, people do have there's this sense of inhibition towards it, but in many different contexts, people are very happy. people love talking about dinosaurs, right? Every time someone talks about a dinosaur, they're using a Latin name. Every time people talk about the plants in their garden, I mean, a huge number of those are the Latin names. And so I think it's rather than the Latin names per se, but more the sort of associations that come with them. And often, the thing as well with Latin names as opposed to popular names is that when people use them, it's not just an attempt to show, oh, look how learned I am, or I'm part of this elite group. But the names themselves, because of the structure of Latin names, where you have the genus followed by the species, you're actually saying something about the evolutionary history of the thing that you're talking about. So, when you talk about Homo sapiens or something like that, you're making a comment about its evolutionary history. And so, even though I understand that it can be a barrier for people, it would almost be like saying people shouldn't learn computer programming because computer programming languages come with a certain there's an arcane rigor, and yes, and there is a barrier that should be overcome. But I think rather than rejecting Latin names and having a million common names which serve their own function, I think it's instead better to make people realize that actually the Latin names, it's not really much of it doesn't need to be a thing, and actually without those inhibitions they can be learned quite just as easily as other names, as long as you have the right associations with them.
I agree with Vanessa that you don't need to know the names to go and enjoy a direct relationship with nature. When we're sharing together, we tend to use the common names because it creates a connection to communities past and present. For example, if you take the hawthorn tree and its common name is Mayflower, and the explanation is because it typically flowered in May, or that it's traditionally been used to make fish hooks because of its thorns. And what we find is cultures develop between the groups of people that we're with, that they refer to it as a fish hook tree, and they all know exactly what they mean by it. So it can really people create their own cultures, but also they're learning something about traditional uses and traditional connections, but also the seasonal knowledge about when plants come into fruition, for example.
I work in a sort of museums and heritage environment, and most of the narrative around decolonising and the kind of ideas you've been talking about is looking to the past and a critique of the past as a way to move forward. And I'm very struck by the fact that all three of you are articulating a way of moving forward that isn't really too referential to the past. So in relation to naming things, the cuckoo names you put up, common cuckoo, which I'm assuming is a sort of European cuckoo species, it's got a name that's not centred on place. And then African cuckoo. I mean, are African cuckoos the spread of the entirety of Africa? That's an enormous range of space. And the Madagascar...
They are actually pretty much, yeah.
Oh, they are. But these seem like, the common cuckoo is a very Eurocentric, Western gaze kind of naming process, and it fits into that Enlightenment structure of knowledge. A lot of what you're saying isn't about a sort of revisiting or a critique of that, which strikes me. And also in relation to going out into the countryside and enjoying nature, there are hugely problematic things, as you're encountering with some of those gatekeeper organisations, evidently, about the histories of some of the organisations that support that within a sort of white British context. So the Scouts, the Woodcraft folk, they have slightly problematic, very particular origins. And I'm struck by the fact that you're not necessarily going outwardly to critique those, but building something new. And I think that's really exciting. And also in relation to, Ted Hughes, I'd be tempted to sort of pick holes in Ted Hughes and target him a bit more actively and do something really sort of critical. I think it's really positive, but I want to know the degree to which each of you feel there's a need to look to that heritage and that past and deconstruct it and reconstruct it. And also in relation to octopuses, there is a sort of past and problematic equivalent in that Clough Williams-Ellis, the architect who built Port Merion and things, wrote a book called England and the Octopus, and it's all about tentacles of the octopus reaching out into the countryside and ruining it. It's a protectionist narrative.
Oh, you must remind me of that title. That's really intriguing. So I have conflicting feelings about what you're saying about sort of acknowledging or critiquing the past more. I think it's important. more for our own collective sort of understanding as a nation, and white people in particular. I'll be honest with you, like the continual refusal to acknowledge, the very violent and fraught ways in which this country was built, and the repercussions of that we still live with today. But I think also, this so often ends up being our work of, critiquing, dismantling, etc. And a lot of people do it and do it well. But actually what I'm finding more and more these days is that people are just tired of that and just make their own thing. And that has been the most interesting and progressive way to address the issues of the past with something new and then moving forward, rather than stagnating in constantly feeling like you have to respond to or object to transgressions of the past. Because who was it? Was it Toni Morrison? Said that the true sort of tragedy of racism is like how it eats up your time. It eats up your freaking time. Like I wanna be an artist, right? And I wanna write about whatever I wanna write about. Okay, and to a lot of people, if I'm not writing about the struggles of being black, then what do I really have to offer to the landscape of the arts? Nothing. So it's rebellious for me to write about octopuses or trees or birds and not actually reference any of the canonical writers, because I'm making a new thing, and. I think we're in really exciting times where, we've got a people of colour nature group that go out and do their own thing. I don't know whether you saw Black Men Walking, that went on tour, written by Testament, and I think it's based on a Black Men's Walking group in Leeds, in Sheffield, that's it. And there's online magazines like Galdem that just got fed up of pandering to the Guardians of this world and just made their own publication. It's just like, I feel like we're just reaching a really interesting point where we're kind of done pandering and like knocking on the door and being like, oh, can you let us in? Or can you, maybe, it's just like, do you know what? Nah. I think there's a time and a place for it, but also our energies are probably better spent building our own things, and not to antagonize what's already there, but just an alternative, just another thing, another perspective, another space, so things aren't quite so homogenous, and that can only ever be a good thing, in my opinion.
When we started doing the work, we were really clear we just wanted to be. We didn't want to have to sort of collude with the fetishization of our presence in nature. But there is the reality that is happening, and are we going to speak to this or are we not? And exactly as you're saying, it eats up your time. If you're talking about the issues that you encounter, then you're not just getting on simply with the task of enjoying and being. But I think when you are, when the door hasn't already been opened, and perhaps you're one of a few people opening them, then you are going to be confronted with a lot of intensity. So I'm often weighing up my time. Am I going to spend my time talking about the hostility, the eco-fascism? If I don't do it, who else is going to? But our approach to the decolonising is not to take on the burden of work ourselves, but we work to help facilitate white practitioners and white organisations to reflect on why they might not be able to attract and engage people of colour, and pass that responsibility back.
So I think in the context of the work that I do about engaging with a lot of the work as a scientist, and especially when you're studying, a lot of your work is about engaging with what came before you, and particularly for the work that I do, I sort of constantly have to confront people who, for example, would have very much disapproved of my origins, or so I always find it quite funny when you have people who are at one side, you're kind of ornithological and scientific heroes, and yet that if you met them in person, they would struggle to accept you as a peer, and so on. I think it's always it's a balance where you want to have that an awareness and an understanding, and also the language that you're using, and you are inheriting a mode of language that has come from these people. And so, yeah, you want to have that awareness whilst at the same time not letting it completely dictate your way forward, because then actually you give these people too much power if you let them define the axis along which you're moving. You know, we're here to define our own axes.
Thank you. So thank you all of you. First of all, this was a really brilliant morning. I have something which I kind of think maybe is more of a comment than a question, but the work that I do as a researcher, partly based on my own life, but mostly as a historian, is concerned with connecting kind of more long-term histories of diaspora and landscape and present conversations, contemporary art. And I have a big gap in the middle. So take, for example, with Guyana, I have a lot of material from the very kind of, let's put from the mid-20th century, when a lot of people came to the UK, and a lot of the fiction and the art produced as a result kind of often looked back to the landscape of Guyana, and there's a lot of kind of psychological and ecological exploration of the experience of moving and remembering and so on. And then there's a lot more recently, almost from the 19th onwards, and there's a big gap in between where it's actually quite difficult to find archives. And I'm very interested in how a lot of you talked about your relationships with your parents or grandparents, and it's amazing that you're writing clearly fantastic fiction and poetry, and you're also I understand weaving in some of your conversations or knowledge that you're getting from your own mother. And that's kind of, a brilliant way of creating an archive. Obviously, an archive doesn't have to be, a kind of technical archive in a stuffy library or anything like that. But yeah, I guess maybe it's just a comment, because I feel more and more that maybe this should also exist as a kind of oral history project where people could contribute and other people could learn and get this sort of generational sense of where this relationship broke, where it actually probably never broke. I think we also too often as historians maybe go with the assumption, oh, there weren't any people of this and that color in the countryside in England throughout the 70s. Like, they weren't there. There's no pictures. We don't get it. We don't see it. So, I mean, and obviously that is not the case. And it would be fantastic to be able to access these narratives. So thank you for sharing, I guess.
Thank you. Any questions? Any more questions?
So your Octopus poem actually just reminded me that once I was on holiday, I think in Mallorca, I can't exactly remember.
Did you see an octopus?
I actually was swimming, and I was kind of face to face with one. And I just remember it was amazing. Obviously, it was amazing, but it was also quite scary, right? Because I just, this is something I didn't really understand. And I was just thinking, compared to Britain, when I go into the countryside looking for animals in nature, I'm never really coming across anything I'm scared of. Whereas kind of my sort of emotional sense is the most dangerous creature in the British countryside is the white racist, right? This is who I'm trying to avoid.
Wow.
And I'm just thinking in terms of people. I guess in terms of immigration and people coming to Britain and having these attitudes of alienation towards the countryside, I'm just wondering whether there's a kind of tension there in terms of what is danger, almost if you're coming from a country where you think, well, if it's kind of like the British countryside doesn't really have that much to offer me in terms of amazing animals. I mean, I love the animals in the British countryside, but I also feel like I can manoeuvre around the idea, the spectre of the white racist. Whereas if you're coming in, it's like, well, why would I go out into this place where actually all I think I'm going to encounter is someone who's going to be hostile to me, but I'm not going to see a giraffe, a lion, or anything that would be kind of more exciting in that way.
I think that's a really interesting point about how we exoticize other landscapes and other animals and then find ours very banal. I find that really interesting. The UK, we've got beautiful beaches. We've got incredible so sometimes I see pictures of this improbably gorgeous landscape, and I'm like, where's that? Is that across the world somewhere? And someone will be like, oh, that's Nova Scotia, and I'm like, what? Do you know what I mean? And I feel like and perhaps this happens wherever you live. If you're accustomed to a space, you take it for granted. I'm sure people are in Barbados just like, whatever, you know, if they've lived there their whole life. But I certainly had that, you know, if I went on holiday, I went abroad, because like what does the UK have for me? But I would question that. I feel like we've got a lot of exciting things. I guess you just have to redefine the exciting thing. But certainly there is that sense of danger. What is and isn't dangerous, I think, is a very interesting question across like race and class lines. It's that Get Out thing, isn't it? When I watched that film, it was a lot, okay, because that was my life, just walking into posh houses in the middle of nowhere, you know, like knowing that I couldn't get away very easily. Do you know what I mean? Like the parents gave me a lift, you know, we're here now and we're stuck. And there's something about the isolation of that I think, in some really deep innate way feels precarious. I've not thought too much about it to like expand on that further, but I think that danger thing, there's definitely something to that.
I'm wondering also if what you're speaking to is perhaps expecting entertainment in nature, big sort of dramatic animals and features. And I think there are a lot of people that watch nature documentaries and venture out, and it's all, where's all the drama? Where is everything? I've led sort of walks with people. It's like, oh, we didn't see this and this didn't happen, and it's all. Sometimes you don't see anything. But tuning into the enjoyment of nature is not just about sort of visual drama and large creatures, but there's can be a very personal connection. And as your work was showing, the smallest flower, the smallest bird can be really thrilling. I think sometimes we can approach life in quite a detached way, like entertain me, rather than a real intimacy of enjoying a very personal connection and just seeing what's there.
I guess I meant it more as a trade-off from someone who isn't necessarily accustomed to British nature. It's sort of like, you know, the dangers that I perceive there, whether rightly or wrongly, they're having to be kind of balanced out with, you know.
Is it worth the while considering?
Yeah, exactly. From my point of view, I know that it is, but it's kind of, I've grown up in Britain, you know, I'm comfortable in those spaces, whereas someone who hasn't and isn't necessarily, I guess it's how do they get to that? How do they come to that decision, I suppose? Yeah,
and I think the work that we're trying to do is just to acknowledge that a lot of people of colour do feel that way. They feel a risk and a sense of danger. Fight or flight system can be up, as you're saying, sort of hyper-vigilant, getting yourself ready for a confrontation that perhaps doesn't even happen. But there's a trauma there. There's something frightening has happened, or our experiences lead us to believe could happen. And I think that's something that we don't always acknowledge. And that's part of the work we're trying to do, is to say that there are very real issues around race in our access to the natural world.
I mean, just to follow up on that idea, I agree with this idea of danger in the natural world, and the sources of danger is very important. And it's I think I've definitely inherited from my dad that fear of trespassing, and that always being that, especially in the English countryside. So as you say, there aren't many creatures that are venomous, or I mean there are a few, but it's not So when I'm doing fieldwork in Zambia, for example, there's very real there's black mambas, puff adders, boomslangs, you know, like and you sort of have that sense of being a sort of heightened awareness as you walk into the long grass, and then when you're walking through a UK forest. There is sometimes this. I actually find it quite liberating, in the sense that I just see I hear a bird calling somewhere, and I can just stride off, you know, because whereas when you enter a long grass in Zambia, there's always this sense where you start to go like that before you go in, just to let a snake know that you're coming. But so for me, instead, the points that I feel, I've noticed very much with myself that I often become a creature of habit when it comes to visiting the nature reserves and natural spaces in the UK, and that's I always feel that there's this kind of energy barrier to be overcome if I'm visiting a nature reserve or a space to look for birds for the first time, and there's always this unnamed fear that somehow I'll arrive and I'll be in the wrong place, or I won't know where the entrance is, and so I actually always find myself doing a lot of research beforehand on like where the parking is and where and it sounds trivial, but I think it does come from this sense that every time you're going to go somewhere new, there's something at stake, that you might do something wrong, or you transgress, or that there'll be some area that you weren't meant to go to. And I think that very much comes from, I did, when I was young, often my dad would join me on these trips, and he very much, having grown up in apartheid South Africa, where space was incredibly racialized, he still carries with him that fear and that sense that you need to, everything needs to be double checked and triple checked before you step over that barrier. And I think I feel that very strongly as an inheritance from my father's experience.
You need to wait for a mic.
First of all, thank you all so much. It's been very, very unusual discussion. I've never been part of a discussion like this, so I'm really, really grateful to you. I mean, there's so many things I'd like to respond to in more detail, but there's one question which is bothering me, and it sort of started, actually, Beth, when you spoke about black leadership in nature. And it seems to me that the context for the conversation we're having is really to do with the climate emergency more than anything else. And although, there are issues about the politics of that unfolding around us, I was just sort of really wondering about how you felt that context altered the things that you wanted to do in the future, given that we're future-oriented today in so much of the conversation. What kind of a difference does that make, and how does it impact on what you think about the future of this work might be?
I guess fundamentally, I perhaps don't agree with the assumption there that it has changed and that perhaps this is the context, although obviously it's a reality. And I think it's the difference between perhaps a definition of ecopsychology and nature-based or nature-allied psychotherapies. That one is in relationship with man's destruction of nature, and one is in relationship with the ideal qualities of nature. And both can exist at the same time. And the work I'm more engaged with is engaging with the ideal qualities of nature, sort of the health rather than the harm. Because I think for a lot of people, until the reparative work is done, it doesn't stop them from wanting to challenge man's destruction, but in a way, it's more healthy coming from a direct relationship rather than an intellectualized position. Does that make sense?
Well, it makes perfect sense, but I'm also thinking, well, everybody has spoken about it as a global question in the remarks we've heard this morning, that there's a planetary aspect. The birds, the plants, the fish, they don't know any boundaries. And, the history of ornithology is bound up with the history of people writing about human migrants as well as migration phenology of animals. So I'm just wondering about the idea that those of us who have heritage, a complicated global heritage, a colonial or post-colonial heritage, isn't there, well, for me, I think, let me speak for myself, I think that means that we have an opportunity, actually, that other people don't have.
Yeah.
And in a way, that's one of the things that Ingrid and Cora and I wondered about as a motivation for trying to bring this conversation together today.
I think the issues come up and look so different from the Western context, because I think when we're talking about countries of heritage and being as people of colour, we're still trying to reclaim a sense of belonging and entitlement to be engaged with nature. And that's what it looks like in terms of leadership, if you like, in terms of climate change. That is the decolonising. That our knowledge of conservation and how to look after the natural world is valid and perhaps healthier for the planet, rather than necessarily stop using plastic, that aspect of climate change. So it perhaps looks a bit different and the issues we're talking about are different. But it is also perhaps a bit more work to make space.
I'm still percolating.
I think in terms of this about being forward-looking and tackling climate change. So I agree that at two levels you have these kinds of there's the danger of the kind of the edict that gets passed out. Like this kind of don't use plastic. But I think that I think you have to have that level, and then you also have the level in which you change people's relationship to the natural world, such that it's not something that's over there, but it's something that we're all interdependent on. And I think that's and actually the renewed awareness of diet, I think, has become quite an important aspect of that, about how what we eat influences the natural world, and how and obviously they went through a long period where through industrialization of meat production and packaging and supermarkets, you get these disconnects, and I think from what you're talking about, this idea of connectivity of us, given our ancestry and how we exist across many places, but also of our interdependence with the environment through what we eat and what we do and how we live, that even as urban city dwellers, people are all these day-to-day decisions that you make have these far-reaching consequences, and I think you need to highlight that, which is obviously being done. But then at the same time, you need to have people valuing the natural world enough that they care that there are these consequences. And for me, at least, the way that you get people to value it is by getting them to know and understand it deeply, and spending more time in it. So I sort of feel like these are all different aspects of the same thing, of understanding the consequences of your actions and caring that those consequences take place.
And perhaps those of us from the diaspora have a unique perspective on how we might look after the world better, excuse me, because of this cultural relativity that we're afforded just by virtue of being born in the circumstances we are. And for me, harking back implies that I ever lived or was part of this country of origin, but to listen to my mother's stories of how she lived as a young girl in Uganda, and also having been there a few times myself, and that sense of communion with the land, i.e. I've stopped eating meat quite recently because I really got it into my head that, Vanessa, you would never take the knife and slit that chicken's throat yourself. You know you wouldn't do it. So if you don't have the chutzpah to like have that real sense of like what is being sacrificed, what part of this world is having to essentially be decimated so that you may basically like have some Nando's, you're not really entitled to take that, right? And I remember seeing a chicken have its head cut off in my jaja, my grandma's compound, when I was 15. And being so traumatized by it, because again, we have this disconnect. We just see chicken thighs in shrink wrap in a supermarket. There's no sense of the life that piece of meat came from. But just seeing this headless chicken running around the compound and being like, oh, okay, this is what this is. Do you know what I mean? Those chickens were in my grandma's compound every day. I heard them, I smelt them. I had an understanding of what that was, the cycle of that, in a way that I had never gotten here. Where perhaps, maybe a child who grows up on a farm in England would understand that. But that having that relativity of, even though I've grown up in mostly suburban environments in the UK, there is a rural heritage from my family in my ancestry. That's kind of helped me to understand what it might be to be a more ethical consumer in this world. And I think there is lots of really interesting ways to approach these thoughts as someone who has multiple backgrounds or ethnicities. So yeah, it's an interesting question, and I'm not too sure whether that was the most coherent idea, but just thinking about it now, that's perhaps what feels the most pertinent or the most interesting for me. Yeah.
Thanks. We've got time for one more question, quickly. So.
First of all, thank you very much. It was very insightful, all of your comments. My question is, I guess, it's kind of about generation, and also about collaborative authority as well. Because in each of your presentations, there was a kind of coming through stories kind of woven in about childhood, about those moments of falling in love with nature, or even in youth, or moments where you just kind of are struck by wonderment. And it struck me that, and even in the play, which Vanessa was talking about the little girl, and the kind of way that your own wonderment was imagined as a child's experience, and a lot of the time when we're talking about kind of, especially in this moment, environmentalism and nature, it's about getting the kids outside and, you know, kids really embracing that wonderment and falling in love with nature in the hope that it will sustain them for life. But I was really interested by the kind of comments about adults who've then found this enjoyment, pleasure, and enthrallment with nature. In a way that's a part of your learning experience, but also just a cathartic personal experience. And we don't really talk about that much, I don't think. And I was just wondering, from your own experiences, what you think we can learn from adults, particularly adult people of colour, but more generally also, who are having that kind of that process, which is likely to be, and you would be able to comment much better than I, very different to a child's experience, and what that looks like, and what we can all kind of learn in this age, I guess also with the environmental question, but really in a social way as well.
You ready? The sort of response is brewing as we speak. So what we can learn from them. I think that you're never too old to develop a relationship with anyone or anything, and I think the wonderment is really appreciated because it's new, and oh my gosh, I didn't know this existed, and particularly, oh, this is on my doorstep, I've lived here for 30 years and I just had no idea. There's something thrilling and exciting, but also there is disappointment. Oh, I wish I knew about this when I was a kid, you know, having those difficult times, or just, you know, why not? It could be really supportive, and I think that's one of the biggest reflections, learnings people have is, wow, just by coming here and sitting, I just feel much calmer and relaxed. That thing was stressing me out and I just came here. So it opens up a whole world of an emotional support system, something free, easy, always available, that helps people feel good. I think sometimes people can also feel self-conscious that they're aware they don't know something that perhaps they might, I don't want to use the word should, but could have known, were other opportunities and circumstances available. So there's some courage in stepping into something that feels unfamiliar and that perhaps you feel a bit ashamed or embarrassed that you don't know about. But the rewards, as we know, are immense. And I think it's exciting that then it opens up a lifelong relationship with something really supportive, something really fun, thrilling, exciting.
Yes, I think the way that I would speak to that as well is that, so even though I started very young with natural history and with birds in particular, more recently I've started getting interested in, say, other groups of plants and animals in the natural world, which I knew very little about. And so, and for me, it's always quite a distressing experience when you enter into a space that you know a lot about one space, but you don't know a lot about another, and then there's always that feeling of vulnerability as you move into that. So I think we can all relate to that feeling of entering a space where you don't feel comfortable. But one of the things that's helped me a lot, bridging those gaps, and I think is a useful tool for people, is you now have access to knowledge in a way that people didn't have in the past. And particularly, there's now websites like iNaturalist, for example, which is absolutely fantastic, where you can take a photograph of a plant or an insect, and you upload the photograph, and they have they've trained machine learning algorithms that can then suggest identifications for you, and they often maybe tell you the family that it's in or something like that, but it just gives you, so you can go with knowing absolutely nothing, and all you need is your phone, and you can just see something you don't know, and literally you just photograph it, upload it, and it suggests you a family, and then you can say, oh, that sounds interesting, and you Google that family and find out about that.
That's going to help me so much, because I can't do it with the bird book, I can't, it's too hard. iNaturalist. iNaturalist?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, cool. That's great, thank you.
And just one final thing, what I often try and do, people talk about beginner's mind as actually something to aspire towards rather than something to shy away from. And one thing that I try and do to sort of recapture that with birds as well is I often pretend that I'm the first person who's ever seen this thing, and I say and it's my job to describe what's there. And so we were talking about names earlier. I sometimes just forget that anybody's ever studied these things, and I just, even if it's a blue tit or a plant or something like that, and I just start making notes and writing notes about it completely independently of field guides or literature or anything like that. And that's a very enjoyable experience. And then later, if you want to, you can then align that to the huge body of knowledge that exists. But if you just pretend that you're the first person who's ever seen it and go from there, I find that a very enabling mindset.
Well, everyone, join me in thanking our 3 speakers for their papers. It's really great.